What people cannot understand, they cannot control, and what they cannot control, they fear. This is not a modern psychological observation. It is one of the oldest and most consistent findings in the entire record of human behavior, present in the courts of ancient China, in the Senate chambers of Republican Rome, in the Renaissance palaces where Machiavelli watched power move between people like weather, between buildings. The legible person is the manageable person. The illegible person is something else entirely, something that the social environment, with all its finely calibrated tools for prediction and influence, cannot quite get its hands around. And the response to that inability is not indifference. It is never indifference. The response is a specific, ancient, automatic alertness, the heightened attention that organisms in any environment direct toward the thing they cannot categorize, cannot predict, cannot safely dismiss. In its most basic form, it is fear, not the fear of a known threat, which produces avoidance, but the fear of an unknown quantity, which produces something more useful, respect. Most people spend their lives trying to become legible. They work to be understood, to present themselves clearly, to signal their intentions consistently, to make their thinking transparent and their positions predictable. They believe, with sincere conviction, that being understood is the precondition of being trusted, and that being trusted is the precondition of being influential. They are half right. Being understood is the precondition of being trusted, but trust and influence are not the same thing. And the person who is fully understood, whose thinking has been fully mapped, whose next move can be anticipated with confidence, whose reactions are predictable to anyone who has spent enough time in their presence, this person is trusted, perhaps, but they are not feared. And in any environment where power matters, the absence of fear is the absence of one of the most durable forms of leverage available. Niccolo Machiavelli spent his career inside the machinery of political power, watching the feared and the merely trusted, the illegible and the fully known. And what he found was as consistent as it was uncomfortable. The person who could not be read held something the fully legible person had permanently surrendered. Not mystery for its own sake, not the cultivated enigma of someone performing depth they don't possess, but the genuine, substantive unknowability of a person whose interiority is real, whose thinking is genuinely complex, and who has learned the discipline of revealing it only when and only to the degree that revelation serves their purpose. This is about that discipline, and it reaches further into the mechanics of human power than almost anything else you will encounter. Let's begin with the psychology, with what actually happens in the mind of the person encountering someone they cannot easily read, because the mechanism is specific and its implications run deeper than the surface observation suggests. The human mind, in its ordinary operation, is continuously engaged in the work of prediction. Every person you encounter is, at a level below conscious awareness, immediately processed for pattern their behavior, compared against accumulated models of how people like this tend to behave, their expressions read for the emotions they signal, their words assessed not only for their content, but for what they reveal about the speaker's actual internal state and probable next moves. This processing is fast, largely automatic, and in most social situations, accurate enough to allow the ordinary business of human interaction to proceed smoothly. When the processing fails, when the person in front of you does not fit the available models, when the expression does not match the expected pattern, when the words reveal less than words in this context, usually reveal the system does not simply give up and move to something else. It escalates. The processing intensifies. More attention is allocated. More cognitive resources are devoted to solving the problem that the illegible person has created. Who is this? Exactly. And what can I expect from them? This allocation of additional attention and cognitive resources is, in itself, a form of power. The illegible person commands more mental space in the minds of the people around them than the legible person does. They are thought about more, analyzed more, discussed more, watched more carefully. Their actions are interpreted with greater care because their meaning is less obvious. Their silences are weighted more heavily because the absence of legible signal is itself information that the social environment will work hard to decode. Machiavelli understood this as a fundamental principle of influence. The person who requires interpretation exerts influence through the very act of being interpreted. The analysis directed at understanding them is not neutral, it is the sustained application of another person's mental energy to the problem of you, and any sustained application of mental energy to a problem tends to make that problem feel more significant, more important, more worthy of careful management than problems that don't require the same investment. The fear that illegibility produces is worth examining precisely because there are multiple kinds of fear, and the kind produced by a person who cannot be read is the specific kind that generates respect rather than avoidance. There is the fear of the known threat, the person whose capacity for harm is visible and established, whose hostility is declared, whose power is quantified. This fear produces a very specific response: strategic avoidance or preemptive neutralization. You move away from the known threat, or you act against it before it can act against you. The known threat is dangerous, but it is navigable because it is known. The fear of the illegible person is different in structure and in consequence. It is the fear that lives in uncertainty, the awareness that you do not have enough information to know whether this person is a threat or an ally, whether their current silence signals contentment or strategic preparation, whether their apparent agreement conceals a different intention that has not yet been revealed. This uncertainty does not produce avoidance. It produces caution, the careful, respectful management of a situation whose full dimensions are not yet visible. Caution is more valuable to you than avoidance. The person who is avoided has been dismissed from the calculation. The person who is approached with caution is being managed, taken seriously, accounted for, treated as someone whose reactions and responses require careful consideration. The cautious management of another person is, by definition, a form of deference to their power. It means their presence is being felt, even when they are doing nothing. Their potential reactions are shaping the behavior of others before they have acted. Their influence is operating in the space of anticipated response, rather than actual response. This is what Machiavelli observed in the most powerful figures he studied, the ones who lasted, who shaped events rather than being shaped by them. They were not always the most aggressive, the most visibly authoritative, or the most overtly threatening. They were often the ones whose inner workings were least accessible to the people around them, whose agreement could not be assumed, whose opposition could not be predicted, whose thinking remained opaque enough that everyone in their environment had to maintain the alertness that uncertainty demands. Let's name what illegibility is not, because the misreading of this principle produces people who are simply strange rather than genuinely powerful. And the distinction matters enormously. Illegibility is not eccentricity. The eccentric person is unpredictable in ways that reflect the absence of consistent principle rather than the presence of hidden depth. The eccentric's behavior cannot be predicted, not because their thinking is sophisticated and selectively revealed, but because their thinking does not follow coherent patterns that could be predicted if the information were available. The fear this produces, where it produces any at all, is the mild, dismissive kind, the wariness of someone who cannot be relied upon to behave consistently, not the respect of someone whose consistent but concealed logic commands careful attention. Illegibility is not coldness. The cold person has been read, their emotional flatness, their consistent distance, their reliable unavailability are themselves legible patterns that can be predicted and accounted for. The cold person has not created uncertainty, they have created certainty about a specific kind of absence. And certainty about absence, however uncomfortable, is navigable. It does not produce the ongoing allocation of attention that genuine illegibility requires. Illegibility is not performance. The most common attempt to manufacture the power of illegibility is the deliberate, constructed presentation of mystery, the practiced inscrutability, the studied silence, the the affected depth that does not correspond to any genuine interior complexity. This performance is almost always visible to anyone with real social acuity. It produces not the fear of the genuinely unknown, but the mild contempt reserved for performances that have been seen through the awareness that the mystery is manufactured, and therefore that what lies beneath it is probably simpler than the performance was designed to suggest. Genuine illegibility, the kind that produces genuine respect, is the natural consequence of genuine interior complexity, selectively and strategically revealed. The person who thinks deeply, whose positions emerge from considerations that are not obvious, whose responses draw on a range of values and assessments that the social environment has not had full access to, this person does not need to perform mystery. The mystery is structural. It is the automatic consequence of being genuinely more than what you have expressed. Machiavelli was precise about what the illegible person actually possesses that the legible person does not. He described it, in various formulations throughout The Prince and the Discourses, as the retention of initiative, the preservation of the capacity to surprise, to reposition, to respond in ways that the people managing your situation had not prepared for. Initiative, in Machiavelli's political philosophy, was the most valuable strategic asset available. The person who retained initiative defined the terms of every engagement, because the terms were not established by declared positions or predictable responses, but by the continuous capacity to introduce something new into a situation that others had assessed as stable. The illegible person, by virtue of their illegibility, always retains a version of this initiative. Their next move cannot be blocked before it is made, because it cannot be anticipated. Their position cannot be countered before it is expressed, because its content is not predictable from the information available. This is not simply useful in conflicts. It is useful in negotiations, in collaborations, in relationships of every kind, because the person whose response is predictable has, in that predictability, given up the leverage that uncertainty provides. The negotiator who has signaled their bottom line cannot hold above it. The colleague whose emotional response to any given input is known in advance can be managed into any position by engineering the right inputs. The partner whose needs and fears have been fully mapped can be navigated around rather than genuinely encountered. The person who has not provided the map cannot be navigated around. They must be engaged with directly as a genuine presence, whose responses must be discovered rather than predicted, whose positions must be encountered rather than anticipated. And direct engagement, genuine encounter, is the only condition in which the full weight of who you are is actually present in the interaction. Let's look at this through history, through a figure whose illegibility was so complete and so strategically maintained that it defined the entire political landscape of his era. Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, the man who unified Germany through a series of wars and diplomatic maneuvers so precisely calculated and so deliberately obscured in their intent that his contemporaries, including the monarchs and statesmen who were nominally his superiors, spent the better part of 3 decades unable to determine, with any confidence, what Bismarck actually wanted. He was not a simple man concealing a simple ambition. He was a genuinely complex thinker whose positions on any given question were shaped by a range of considerations that he never fully disclosed to any single person. Different interlocutors received different versions of his thinking, not lies, but selections, framings that revealed enough to make the interaction productive and concealed enough to preserve the space within which his actual intentions could continue to develop. The result was that every major player in the European political landscape of the second half of the 19th century, the French, the Austrians, the Russians, the British, even the Prussian king he ostensibly served, managed their relationship to Bismarck with a caution and a deference that his formal position alone would not have commanded. They did not know what he would do next. They could not confidently predict where his strategic flexibility would carry him, what alignments he might form, what apparently settled questions he might suddenly reopen. That uncertainty was not an accident. It was not the byproduct of an especially complex personality. It was maintained with extraordinary deliberateness. Bismarck was famous for the management of his own image, for the careful control of what was known about him and what was not, for the discipline of never committing publicly to positions that he might need to revise privately. He preserved his initiative so systematically that even his eventual successors, who inherited all of his formal power, could not reproduce his influence, because his influence derived not from the position, but from the illegibility. And the illegibility died with the man who had cultivated it. Now, let's move from the historical to the immediate to the specific daily practices by which genuine illegibility is developed and maintained. The first and most foundational practice is the discipline of the unexpressed reaction. Most people's first responses to things, to news, to proposals, to provocations, to compliments are visible. The face moves before the mind has decided whether the face should move. The posture shifts. The energy changes in ways that communicate to anyone watching that something has landed and what kind of something it was. This immediate legibility of reaction is the most exploitable form of transparency available, because it provides real-time feedback on every input, a continuous update on what is reaching you and how, which anyone paying attention can use to calibrate their approach. The discipline of the unexpressed reaction is not the performance of blankness. It is the genuine, practiced delay of public response, the cultivation of enough space between the arrival of the input and the expression of the reaction, that the reaction, when it comes, is chosen rather than automatic, not suppressed, chosen. The anger that arrives is felt completely and expressed selectively. The pleasure that arrives is experienced fully and revealed proportionally. The calculation that arrives is performed internally and presented when its presentation serves. This practice, consistently maintained, produces a face that provides less information than most faces, not the blank face of someone who feels nothing, but the measured face of someone who has learned that their reactions are not public property. The second practice is the discipline of the uncompleted sentence. The person who always finishes their thought, who takes every conversation to its logical conclusion, who answers every question with the full answer, who explains their position until the last qualification has been expressed and every reservation addressed, this person has left nothing for the listener to wonder about. The thinking has been heard completely. The position is known. The next question, the next challenge, the next approach can now be precisely calibrated to what has been revealed. The person who ends before the end, who offers the thought that opens the question rather than closing it, who provides the observation that invites consideration rather than the conclusion that forecloses it, who answers with enough to be genuinely engaged and not quite enough to be completely understood. This person leaves the conversation with more of themselves intact, more of the thinking unrevealed, more of the position uncharted. This is not obscurity for its own sake. It is the management of what is available for others to work with, the preservation of interior space that complete expression would have handed over. Machiavelli admired the prince who could sit in council, hear all positions fully expressed, and offer a response that drew on more than what the council knew he had access to. The council could not refute what they could not see. The prince, who revealed only the conclusion, not the full reasoning, maintained the authority of the conclusion without exposing the reasoning to the challenges that full exposure would have invited. The third practice is the most demanding, and the one that makes everything else genuine rather than performed. It is the continuous development of genuine interior complexity. There is no sustainable version of illegibility that is not grounded in an interior that is genuinely more complex than what has been expressed. The performance of mystery can last through a single encounter, perhaps through several, but sustained illegibility, the kind that persists across months and years of interaction with people who are actively trying to understand you, requires that there actually be more to understand than has yet been revealed, requires that the depths being alluded to actually exist, requires a genuine interior life, real thinking, real values, real engagement with ideas and experiences that have shaped a perspective too multidimensional to be fully expressed in any single conversation or relationship. This is the most important instruction in this entire video, and it is worth sitting with its full implication. You cannot manufacture the power of illegibility. You can only develop the interior that makes illegibility honest, and then exercise the discipline of revealing it selectively, at the pace and in the proportion that serves your purposes, rather than the social environment's appetite for complete understanding. Machiavelli's most sophisticated figures were not performing depth, they possessed it. Their illegibility was structural, the natural consequence of genuinely complex thinking, brought into contact with a world that wanted simpler answers than the thinking could honestly provide. The discipline they exercised was not the manufacture of mystery, but the management of revelation, the decision about how much of the genuine complexity to make visible and when. Develop the interior, then govern what you show of it. In that sequence, and only in that sequence, does genuine illegibility become available. Here is what changes when you become genuinely difficult to read, not in single dramatic moments, but in the accumulated texture of how people move around you over time. Conversations with you become more careful, not hostile careful. People choose their words with more attention than they bring to conversations where the response is predictable. They test positions more tentatively before committing to them fully. They watch for your response before assuming they know what it will be. This caution is not discomfort, it is the particular quality of engagement that genuine respect produces. They are present with you in a way that the fully legible person does not compel. Decisions that affect you are made with more consideration of your possible response, more hedging, more consultation, more reluctance to simply assume you will accept whatever is offered, because you always have before. The space created by uncertainty about your reaction is a space in which your interests are more carefully accounted for, your position more thoroughly considered, your response more anxiously anticipated than when your response is known in advance. Your silence carries more weight. When the room does not know what your silence means, whether it signals agreement, disagreement, consideration, or something else entirely, the silence is attended to with a quality of focused concern that the silence of the fully legible person does not receive. The unknown quality of what the silence contains makes it louder than many speeches, and your words, when they come, carry more weight than words that arrive in a predictable stream. The person who speaks selectively and from a place that has not been fully mapped produces, in the listener, the particular quality of attention that rare things produce. The statement from someone whose thinking is not fully visible is read more carefully, interpreted more thoroughly, assigned more significance than the statement from someone whose thinking has already been assembled in advance of their speaking. Let's be honest about what this practice requires, because Machiavelli never trafficked in comfortable fictions, and this philosophy in his name should not either. Genuine illegibility costs something. It costs the ease of being fully known. It costs the specific warmth of relationships where all walls are down, where the full interior is shared freely, where being understood in every dimension is possible because every dimension has been made available. There are people in whose presence this kind of complete openness is not only possible but genuinely right, and the indiscriminate application of strategic illegibility to those relationships would be a poverty disguised as power. The discipline of illegibility is for the arena, for the environments where power matters, where the full disclosure of your thinking creates vulnerabilities that will be exploited rather than honored, where the people around you are navigating their own interests and will use the map you provide accordingly. In those environments, the practice is not a choice between power and authenticity. It is a choice between authenticity expressed to everyone and authenticity protected for the people who have earned it. Machiavelli understood this distinction. He admired not the prince who was opaque to everyone, that is, isolation, and isolation is its own kind of powerlessness. He admired the prince who was legible to the right, few, and illegible to the necessary many, who had the discernment to know which relationships deserved the full interior and which relationships deserved only what was strategically useful to share. That discernment is the practice beneath the practice, and it is, in the end, the most sophisticated form of the entire philosophy. So here is what you take from this. The fear that the illegible person produces is not a fear of malice. It is the primal, structural, entirely rational alertness that human beings direct toward genuine depth they cannot fully account for, toward the person who is demonstrably more than has been expressed, whose next move carries the productive uncertainty that commands respect before it has done anything to earn it. You do not manufacture this by performing mystery. You do not achieve it by being deliberately confusing or strategically withholding in ways that have no interior substance to justify them. You build it slowly, genuinely, through the real development of an interior so rich and so honest that any expression of it is necessarily incomplete, and the incompleteness is not a performance but an accurate reflection of the fact that there is genuinely more than any single conversation or relationship can contain. Machiavelli watched the powerful for 14 years and wrote what he actually saw. What he saw was consistent across every context and every culture and every level of the hierarchy. The people who lasted, who shaped things rather than being shaped, who were managed with caution rather than used with ease. These people shared the quality of genuine depth, selectively and deliberately revealed. Not performed, possessed. Build the depth, govern the disclosure, and let the fear do what fear of genuine substance has always done, transform itself, in the minds of the people encountering you, into the specific, durable, unmistakable form of attention that is the oldest name for respect.